Close your eyes and let the word vampire drift through your mind. What do you see? Most likely, it is a creature of terrible beauty, a high-collared aristocrat, pale as marble, moving through the ballrooms of eternity. He is wealthy, he is seductive, and in his melancholy gaze, you see the weight of centuries. From Bram Stoker to modern cinema, we have been taught that vampirism is a dark gift, a curse of the elite. But this image is a lie, a fabrication created by bored poets in the 19th century. If we were to travel back to the true birthplace of the vampire, to the rural villages of Serbia, Poland, and Romania in the 1700s, you would not find a gentleman. You would find a peasant named Petar. He is not pale, he is purple. He is not thin, he is bloated like a tick ready to burst. He does not live in a castle. He is scratching at the lid of a wooden coffin, smelling of wet earth and excrement. The true history of the vampire is not a romance. It is a detective story about mass hysteria, misunderstood biology, and the terrifying silence of the pre-scientific world. Today, we are going to exhume the truth. Grab your shovel. We are going into the grave. To understand the panic, we must look at the patient zero of the vampire epidemic. While Petar Blagojevich was the first, the case that truly terrified Europe happened 5 years later in 1727. Enter a Serbian hajduk, a soldier named Arnold Pole. Arnold returned to his village near Belgrade, claiming he had been troubled by a vampire in Greece. To cure himself, he had eaten grave soil and smeared himself with the blood of the undead. He thought he was safe. But a few months later, Arnold died in a freak accident. He fell from a hay wagon and broke his neck. They buried him, but death was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, 4 people in the village died suddenly. Before the end, they claimed Arnold had visited them in the night. Panic spread like wildfire. The villagers dug up Arnold's body. According to the official Austrian military report, documents that still exist today, Arnold did not look dead. His body was red, his skin was fresh, and his nails had grown. When they pierced his heart with a stake, the report says he let out a terrible audible groan. They burned him to ash, but the hysteria did not stop. 5 years later, the infection returned, killing dozens more. This forced the Austrian Empire to send their best army surgeons to investigate. They weren't hunting ghosts, they were hunting a contagion. To understand the monster, we must look at death through the eyes of an 18th century peasant. Imagine you are an Austrian military doctor in 1725. You are sent to a remote Serbian village. The locals are terrified. They claim a man named Petar Blagojevich, who died weeks ago, has returned to strangle them in their sleep. You are a man of science, so you order the grave opened, and what you see defies logic. Petar has been dead for weeks, yet he looks healthier than when he was alive. His old, rough skin has peeled away, revealing fresh pink skin underneath. His hair and nails seem to have grown longer in the coffin. He looks well-fed, and most terrifying of all, his mouth is stained with fresh blood. The villagers scream, "Vampire!" and drive a stake through his heart. The body lets out a groan. Blood sprays everywhere. To them, this is proof of life. But to modern science, this is simply the theater of decomposition. Let's break down the illusion. Fresh skin? That is just the top layer rotting off, leaving the raw dermis beneath. The growing nails? An optical illusion. The skin dries and shrinks back, exposing the roots. The groan? That is simply trapped gas escaping through the throat past the vocal cords. And the well-fed look? This is the key. Bacteria in the gut produce gas. This gas inflates the body like a balloon, pushing liquid blood from the lungs up into the mouth. This is why historical vampires were described as ruddy and fat. They were simply decomposing in a closed box. Sometimes the soil performs an even stranger trick. It turns the body fat into a substance like wax. Imagine digging up your grandfather 5 years later, and he looks like a perfect mannequin, preserved by the earth itself. That is not magic, but to a terrified farmer, it is the seed of a nightmare. The fear was so real that people developed a toolkit to stop the dead from rising. We know this not just from stories, but from archaeology. Across Eastern Europe, we find graves that whisper of terror. In Poland, at the Drawsko Cemetery, archaeologists found skeletons buried with iron sickles placed across their throats. The logic was brutal. If the corpse tried to sit up, the sharp blade would decapitate it. In other graves, we find heavy stones placed on the chest, pinning the dead to the earth, or bodies buried face down, so that if they tried to dig their way out, they would only dig themselves deeper into hell. And perhaps the most disturbing find comes from Venice, Italy. During a plague outbreak, gravediggers found a woman in a mass grave whose shroud had been eaten away by stomach acid. They believed she was a shroud eater, a type of vampire that causes plague by chewing on its burial clothes. To stop her, they shoved a literal brick into her mouth, jamming her jaw open so she could never chew again. These were not rituals of hate. They were rituals of desperate protection performed by people who truly believed their loved ones had become monsters. But a bloated corpse is passive. A vampire is active. It hunts. It bites. It hates the sun. Where did this specific behavior come from? History tells us that the vampire myth is likely a folk diagnosis for 3 real diseases. First, consider the rage. Why does the vampire act like a beast? Why does it bite? Look at the timeline. The great vampire epidemic of the 1720s coincides perfectly with outbreaks of rabies in dogs and wolves. Rabies attacks the brain. It makes a man aggressive. It creates a fear of water, hydrophobia. It creates a hypersensitivity to light and strong smells, like garlic. And crucially, it spreads through a bite. When a peasant saw a man foaming at the mouth, howling and biting his neighbors, he didn't see a virus, he saw a demon. But rabies creates a chaotic monster. What about the vampire that slowly drains the life of his family? This is the second culprit, the consumption, or tuberculosis. Before germ theory, TB was a mystery. People just wasted away. They became pale, thin, and coughed up blood. But here's the horror. TB is contagious. If a father died, his children would often get sick weeks later. To the villagers, it didn't look like infection. It looked like the dead father was returning from the grave to feed on the life force of his own kin. This is why, in folklore, vampires always kill their families first. And finally, why do they burn in the sun? Later in history, as corn became a cheap staple food in poor regions, a disease called pellagra appeared. It caused a horrific skin condition. Victims became pale, but if they stepped into sunlight, their skin would blister, crack, and turn black, as if burned by invisible fire. Combine these 3. The aggression of rabies, the wasting of TB, the sun sensitivity of pellagra, you have just built a vampire. By 1755, the hysteria was so bad that the graves were being dug up across the empire. The stench of burning bodies filled the air. Finally, the Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, had enough. She did something unprecedented. She sent her personal physician, Gerard van Swieten, to investigate. Van Swieten was a man of the Enlightenment. He examined the bodies. He saw the bloating, the fresh skin, the blood. But instead of magic, he used reason. He wrote a report concluding that vampires did not exist. He explained that the miracles were simply natural processes of fermentation and rot in the absence of oxygen. He called the vampire hunters barbarians of ignorance. Based on his report, the Empress passed a law banning the opening of graves and the desecration of bodies. In a way, it wasn't a stake that killed the vampire. It was a bureaucrat with a pen. And there is one final piece of evidence: the word itself. Before the 18th century, the English language had no word for vampire. We had ghosts, we had revenants, but no vampires. The word comes directly from the Serbian vampir, which likely has roots in the ancient Slavic word upir. It traveled to the west in the saddlebags of those Austrian officials. When their reports hit the newspapers of London and Paris, the word exploded across the continent. Europe didn't just inherit a monster, it inherited a name. So, for centuries, the vampire was a rotting peasant or a sick relative, a disgusting creature. How did he become the sexy, caped aristocrat we know today? We can pinpoint the exact moment. The year is 1816, the year without a summer. A massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia covered the globe in ash. In Switzerland, a group of young British writers gathered at a villa, trapped inside by incessant rain, thunder, and darkness. The vibe was apocalyptic. Among them was Lord Byron. Think of him as the rock star of the 19th century. He was famous, he was scandalous, he was cruel, and he was dangerously attractive. Sitting in the corner was his young, frustrated doctor, John Polidori. To pass the time, they told ghost stories. Mary Shelley started writing Frankenstein. But Polidori? He looked at Byron, and he had an idea. He took the folklore monster, the peasant, and gave it Byron's personality. He wrote The Vampire. In his story, the monster was Lord Ruthven, a nobleman who walked in high society. He didn't just bite people, he seduced them. He was cold, cynical, and wealthy. This was the revolution. Suddenly, the vampire was not an it, he was a he. Decades later, Bram Stoker took this Byronic hero and added the final touches: the castle, the bats, the lack of reflection. But make no mistake, the vampire we love today isn't a monster from ancient myths. He is a caricature of a British bad boy poet dreamed up on a rainy weekend in Switzerland. We have traveled from the muddy graves of Serbia to the villas of Switzerland. We have seen how a decomposing body became a myth, and how a myth became a superstar. Why does this legend refuse to die? Because the vampire is a mirror. In the 1700s, he reflected our fear of disease and death. Today, he reflects our obsession with youth and power. As long as humans fear the grave, the vampire will walk among us. So, the next time you see a handsome monster on screen, remember Petar. Remember the smell of the earth. Thank you for watching. If this autopsy of a myth fascinated you, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments, which monster should we dissect next? The tragedy of the werewolf or the deep-sea madness of the kraken? Until then, keep a light on.